Hey everyone, how's your day going? Whether it's been good or rough, you're not alone. So sit back, relax, and let's step into the world of mystery together. I never believed in ghosts, curses, or any of that supernatural nonsense. At least, not until we moved into that house. It was an old farmhouse tucked away in rural Pennsylvania with acres of open fields and a dense tree line in the distance. The kind of place you'd see on a postcard, quaint, peaceful, isolated. My wife and I thought it was the perfect spot to raise our two boys, James, 10, and Evan, 7, away from the noise and distractions of the city. At first, everything seemed fine. The house was in great condition for something built in the early 1900s, and the surrounding land was beautiful. But there was something off about it. You could feel it the moment you stepped onto the property, a sort of heaviness in the air, like the earth itself was holding its breath. We brushed it off. Maybe it was just the eerie silence of the countryside, so different from what we were used to. Then the nightmares started. James, our oldest, was the first to notice something was wrong. It began with restless nights. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, his breathing shallow, shaking. When we asked what was wrong, he'd just mutter something about bad dreams. But these weren't just bad dreams. One night, after yet another fitful sleep, James finally told us what he was seeing. He described bodies buried in the earth, stacked on top of one another, their skin bloated and blue, mouths open in silent screams. Women impaled on spikes, children with hollowed-out eyes staring at him. Worse yet, he saw creatures, things that weren't human, feasting on the corpses beneath the dirt. I wanted to believe he'd just been watching something scary on TV, maybe overheard an old ghost story. But the details, they were too specific. Too gruesome for a child's imagination. Then he said something that chilled me to the bone. "It's under the barn," he whispered, "the ground moves at night." We owned a small barn a few hundred yards from the house, mostly used for storage. During the day, it was nothing special, just an old structure with creaky wooden beams and dust dancing in the sunlight. But at night, something felt different. One evening, I decided to check it out myself. Armed with a flashlight, I walked to the barn just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air grew colder, unnaturally so, sending chills up my spine. I stepped inside, scanning the interior. Nothing seemed out of place. Then I heard it. A low, scraping sound. Like something was digging. My breath hitched. It wasn't an animal. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. Someone or something was down there. The dirt floor looked undisturbed, but when I knelt down, I noticed something strange. The soil was soft. Recently moved. I ran back to the house, grabbed a shovel, and started digging. I barely had to go a foot down before I hit something hard. Wood. A trapdoor. With my heart hammering in my chest, I pried the trapdoor open. A rush of stale, putrid air hit me, making me gag. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a hole descending into the earth, a deep, narrow pit lined with crumbling bricks. I should have stopped there. I should have shut the trapdoor, sealed it, and never looked back. But I didn't. I climbed down. The deeper I went, the worse the stench became, something rotting, decomposing. At the bottom, the dirt gave way to something else, bones. Dozens of them. Human. Some old and brittle, others disturbingly fresh. Something had been feeding here. Then I heard breathing. Not mine. Slow, shallow breaths coming from the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. I pointed the beam forward and saw movement. A hand, pale and shriveled, slowly retracting into the shadows. Then the whispering started. Voices. Dozens of them. Layered on top of one another, speaking in a language I didn't understand. I scrambled back up the ladder, my hands slipping on the damp bricks. The whispering turned into screams, loud, desperate, agonized. As I reached the top, I saw something crawling up the pit after me. It wasn't human. It was something that had once been human. I slammed the trapdoor shut and ran back to the house, locking every door and window behind me. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We decided to leave the next morning, no questions asked. We packed up whatever we could fit into the car. But just as we were about to leave, James pointed out the window, his face pale. "The holes," he whispered. We looked outside. The ground around the barn was moving, shifting as if something beneath it was breathing. More holes were opening up, gaping mouths in the earth, like the land itself was hungry. We didn't stay to find out what was coming next. We never went back. A year later, curiosity got the best of me. I searched for any records about the property. What I found still haunts me. The land had been owned by a family in the early 1900s who mysteriously vanished. Locals whispered about a curse, about something buried beneath the earth that should never have been disturbed. And then I found a newspaper clipping from 1987. Local farmer missing after reporting strange holes on his land. Authorities found his home abandoned. No trace of him was ever found. I still wonder, had we stayed one more night, would we have disappeared too? Sometimes late at night when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear it again. The sound of something digging. I don't remember what happened that day, but my mother never forgot. And to this day, I still don't know how I ended up under that bed. It was 1985. I was just a few months old when my mother took me and my older siblings, my sister, Emily, and two brothers, Daniel and Mark, back to her hometown in rural Louisiana to visit my grandparents. My father was in the army and stationed overseas, so we spent the summer at their old house, a weathered but cozy place surrounded by oak trees and thick, swaying grass. That house had been in my family for generations. My grandparents had raised 6 children there, and even in the 80s, it still held the scent of old cedar and homemade bread. It was the kind of home that felt warm and safe, filled with laughter and childhood memories. But not everything about it was comforting. There were stories. Stories my mother only half believed. Stories about strange occurrences in that house. Stories that, after that day, she never doubted again. It was a humid summer afternoon and my mother had just put me down for a nap. She was exhausted from chasing after my siblings all morning, so she laid beside me on the bed, letting herself drift off to sleep. It wasn't unusual, just a mother catching a few moments of rest beside her baby. She swears she didn't sleep long, but when she woke up, I was gone. At first, she thought Emily or one of my brothers had carried me off to play. But when she stepped into the hallway, the house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. My siblings were all still napping in the living room, untouched, undisturbed. Her heart started pounding. She checked the kitchen, the bathroom, even the front porch. Nothing. My grandmother, who had been busy preparing lunch, frowned when my mother asked if she'd taken me. "No, honey," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I haven't moved from this kitchen." Panic set in. My mother tore through the house, flipping over blankets, searching behind furniture, calling my name even though I was too young to answer. And then she heard it. A faint, muffled cry. She froze, her ears straining. The sound was so soft, she almost convinced herself she imagined it. But then there it was again. A weak, stifled whimper, coming from the bedroom. She ran back inside, following the sound. But when she reached the bed where she had laid me down, it was still empty. She stood there, confused. The crying continued, close, too close, but she couldn't see me anywhere. And then something made her drop to her knees. She lifted the hanging sheet that draped over the bottom of the old wooden bed frame. And there I was, curled up on the cold wooden floor, still wrapped tightly in my blanket exactly as she had left me. She grabbed me, holding me close, checking my face for any signs of injury. I wasn't hurt, just scared, my cheeks damp with tears. I clung to her, sniffling, unaware of the terror pulsing through her veins. She sat there, rocking me, trying to make sense of it. The bed was high, too high for a baby to roll off. And even if I had somehow managed to fall, I should have hit the floor with a loud thud, screaming. But she had slept through it. There had been no sound, no impact, nothing. And the blanket. I was still perfectly wrapped, swaddled as if I had never been moved. No one could explain it. My brothers swore they hadn't touched me. My grandmother was just as baffled as my mother. No one had seen anything. It was as if I had simply disappeared. Or worse, as if something had taken me. That night, as my mother recounted the story to my grandmother in hushed tones, my grandmother simply nodded. "I've heard of this before," she said, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "There's another village, you know? One that exists alongside ours." My mother frowned. "What are you talking about?" My grandmother looked out the window, past the swaying trees. "It's always been here. People don't talk about it much anymore, but when I was young, we all knew. They can see us, but we can't see them." She sipped her tea, eyes distant. "Sometimes they take a liking to someone. A child, usually. They take them for a little while, just to play." My mother stared at her, horrified. "But they put them back, right?" My grandmother smiled. But it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they don't have all the answers. Most of the time. Years later. I never knew about any of this until I was older. My mother kept it from me, afraid it would scare me. But something strange has always lingered at the back of my mind. Even now, as an adult, I sometimes hear whispers when I'm alone. Voices just out of reach, murmuring in a language I don't understand. At night, when I wake suddenly, I have the uncanny feeling that someone is standing by my bed, just out of sight. And then there are the mirrors. Sometimes when I glance into one too quickly, I catch something that shouldn't be there. A shadowy figure. A child standing just behind me, watching. And in those moments, a thought always creeps into my mind that maybe I was never meant to come back alone. There are some houses that you can feel watching you. Not in a paranoid, ghost story kind of way, but in the way a predator watches its prey, silent, patient, waiting. My family lived in one of those houses. It was a grand, colonial-style home in Charleston, South Carolina, built in the early 1900s. 3 stories tall, whitewashed with black shutters, and a wraparound porch that overlooked a yard filled with towering oak trees draped in Spanish moss. To anyone passing by, it looked elegant, almost inviting. But for those who lived inside, it was something else entirely. The house had a reputation. Neighbors whispered about it. Tradesmen refused to work there for long. Tenants never stayed. My family, though, had owned it for generations, and my grandmother, the matriarch of the house, never entertained nonsense about ghosts. This house has stood longer than any of us, she would say. Respect it and it'll respect you. But it never felt like respect. It felt like it was waiting. We, my parents, my older sister, and I lived in the house with my grandmother and my uncle. And while my family never spoke of it openly, we all knew the house had its preferences. It didn't bother my grandmother. Not once. It didn't bother my parents either. But visitors? Guests? They never lasted. The plumber who came to fix a leak in the ceiling left halfway through the job, pale and shaken, refusing to say why. The housekeepers my mother hired never stayed more than a few weeks, always citing bad energy or a strange feeling. And tenants? We had a separate wing of the house my grandmother rented out, but it never kept occupants for long. They left in the middle of the night, abandoning deposits, some even leaving their belongings behind. They hear things, my uncle muttered once. See things? I never knew what he meant. Not until Lang moved in. Lang was the son of a family friend. A college student looking for a cheap place to stay while he waited for dorm housing to open up. Don't, my aunt warned. The house won't like him. But Lang laughed at superstition. Ghosts? Come on, he said, shaking his head. What's a haunted house gonna do? Flicker the lights? He moved in on a Saturday. By Sunday night, the house had decided it didn't want him there. It started with the whispers. He told me later that the first night he woke up to the sound of someone talking. It was like a conversation right outside my door, he said. Except when I opened it, there was no one there. By Monday, he heard footsteps. By Tuesday, he heard breathing deep, slow, just beyond his closet door. By Wednesday, he started keeping the lights on. By Thursday, he stopped sleeping entirely. And by Friday, he screamed. It was just past midnight when the house erupted. My entire family woke to the sound of furniture crashing, banging, and Lang's voice, raw with terror, shouting from his room. My uncle was the first to reach him, throwing the door open. Lang was in the corner, pressed against the wall, his eyes wide with horror. The lamp was shattered on the floor. The closet door was hanging open. What happened? My grandmother demanded. Lang was shaking too hard to speak. It took nearly an hour before he finally told us. I was sleeping, he whispered, and I woke up because I felt something. Something in the room with me. Watching, ***. He thought it was a nightmare, but then his blankets were yanked off. Not slid, not pulled. Yanked. He scrambled up, turning on the light, scanning the room. Nothing. Then the closet door creaked open. I thought maybe it had been open already, he admitted. Maybe it was just the air conditioning or something. Then he saw the hand. Fingers, pale and impossibly long, wrapping around the edge of the door. And then Lang swallowed hard, eyes darting to the hallway as if expecting something to emerge. It smiled at me. Smiled, my mother echoed. There was a face, he whispered, peering through the crack, grinning, like it had been waiting for me to see it. And that was when he screamed. Lang was gone the next day. He didn't even take his things. Just grabbed his keys and left, muttering something about staying with a friend until he could move into his dorm. It didn't like him, my uncle muttered, shaking his head. The house. It never does with strangers. That was the first time my grandmother didn't dismiss it outright. She only took a slow sip of her coffee and said, some people don't belong here. We never spoke of it again. But a few months later, I overheard my uncle talking to my grandmother in hushed tones. Someone else used to live in that room, didn't they? He asked. Back before the house was ours. A long pause. Then quietly, yes. And what happened to them? He pressed. Another pause. Then my grandmother set her coffee cup down. Some people don't belong here, she repeated. And some people never leave. Years passed. I moved away, went to college, started a life of my own. But the house remained. And then one night I got a call from my sister. Are you alone? She asked, voice hushed. Yeah, I said, glancing around my apartment. Why? She hesitated. Then I was at Grandma's tonight. I went by to drop something off and she exhaled sharply. I swear to God I saw him. Saw who? I asked. Lang? A long silence. Then barely above a whisper. No, the one from his closet. I laughed, but it came out forced. You're messing with me. I'm not. Her voice was dead serious. I was walking past that room and the closet door was open. And for just a second, there was someone standing inside. A shadow. A shape. Tall and thin and watching. I blinked, she said, and it was gone. You're sure? Yeah, she whispered. Because when I turned to leave, I heard something. What? I asked, my throat suddenly dry. She swallowed hard. It laughed. I haven't been back since. And I never will. But sometimes when I wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, I get the strangest feeling. Like something is watching. Like something is waiting. Like the house still remembers me.